And welcome to this first video tutorial showing an overview of the AGK World Builder. So what I'm going to do in this one is just cover very quickly the generals of movement and controls, and then we're going to look at the general landscaping menu to see what that looks like. So when you first load it up, this is what you'll see. You'll be landed on the ground and you'll just be in the middle of the ocean looking at sky and blue water. So holding the right mouse button allows you to look about, while W, A, S and D allow you to move the camera. If you hold down Shift, the camera will move much faster. Now the world is initially split into 8x8 chunks, so you can see that is 64 chunks, and at the moment I'm in chunk 28 at the moment. I can fly around and that chunk will change, so I'm just going to quickly go back to chunk 28. Now that is the generals of movement. But what I'm now going to do is go through the different menu options at the top. So we have, just a quick overview, we have game mode, that obviously allows you to test it in third or first person. We have an option to just rework all the normals in the world, although that is done as we edit. We have an ability to edit all the layers. Now this is the scale of the textures I'll come to another time. We have grass mode, which allows us to plant and create grass areas. Sculpting mode, which we'll go through in a minute. We have path mode. Now this is the one that allows you to draw paths in the landscape, and you can have up to 3 of those. Now there's a hierarchy to how everything renders in the game, so you have up to 8 textures on the landscape which render in numerical order. So the first one renders at the bottom, and then the next one will overwrite that one, and so forth, blending where transparency occurs. Then paths will override all of the landscape, so they'll always appear on top, again in hierarchical order, so the bottom texture will always be underneath the top texture and so forth. And then in between the two we have grass. So grass areas will always render on top of landscape, but paths will always cut across the grass area. So the path is always going to be your top thing. It doesn't have to be used for paths, you can use it as another painting method if there's something in particular that you want to override grass in particular. One of the tricks I use in my example world I've demoed before was underneath plants where it's normally rendered grass, I've drawn paths in a big square with a dirt texture, so it appears like it's dirt cutting through the grass. We have particle editors here, object mode, and then we have paint mode, which is where we paint those landscape textures. In this one we can also set up NPCs and give them paths and instructions and basic routes that they can follow. And we have light mode where we can set light. Now at the moment we have ocean and sky options, but they're not actually do anything. I can click them, nothing happens at the moment, but they will later on allow you to completely freely edit all the textures in the water, as well as most of the variables that go in the shader. So you should be able to play with the water, and I can indeed toggle it between the sort of cartoony look it defaults to and a slightly less cartoony look, but I quite like the cartoon one. I like the shapes it creates. And then the sky one will allow you to change textures in the clouds and the base colours and maybe the time of day. You'll have to see. So you can see the sun's over here, but we'll sort all that out. So what I want to do and cover off in this one just quickly is basic sculpting. Now you can see, or hopefully hear, that because I've gone high enough there's some wind noise playing at the moment. So I'm just going to come down a little bit in there. But when I go into sculpt mode, I'll automatically jump into editing mode. Now at the moment you can't see anything because the landscape's below the surface of the water. So I'm going to run through the tools. What we have is the ability to raise and lower the landscape. Okay, now we also have something to fix the seams. So occasionally between the chunks, depending on the tool we're using, you might end up with a gap where the chunks in the landscape don't perfectly line up. So clicking this tool will automatically fix any disjointed seams so that the landscape is one continual object. We have an ability to freely smooth, we have an ability to smooth an entire chunk of landscape in one go. You can actually hold down the shift key and click that and it will smooth your entire world if that's what you want it to do. We can unilaterally raise and lower land, and we have a leveling tool. And the leveling tool allows you to either completely cut a mountain top off and create land underneath it, or lower the ground to that level, but I'll show you that in full. And we have alter mountains. So what I'm going to do is, because I'm in the middle of the ocean, I don't really know what's going to go on, I'm just going to unilaterally raise the landscape in this chunk a few times till it appears. Boom. And just like that we have our landscape. Now here I've clicked with the mouse before, so I've automatically created that landscape. So what I can do, since I've defaulted back to normal route, I can use the mouse wheel to change the maximum area that I'm affecting. But if I just set it to a medium sized brush just now, again I can look around with the right mouse button held down, but with the left mouse button I can start drawing in hills. Now as I draw, the landscape will emerge, and as soon as I let go of the mouse button it will fix the normals for the area that I've just done, because it can be a little bit confusing trying to draw the landscape when you can't really clearly make out the hills. Now at the moment, if I just quickly jump into this one here and I paint a spot of landscape, you'll see that what actually happens is it gets replaced with this default texture that says no texture. Now that should come up across the landscape, but there's a bug in here somewhere just now and it doesn't actually come up until you first paint the landscape, so it should be like that. Makes it a little bit easier. So I'll just continue to draw a little bit of land here. And again, when I let go of the mouse, it will fix the normals. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a slightly bigger area, just around this bit here, and trail that off. And when I let go, it will fix the normals. So now what I'm going to do, just to demo a few more of the tools, I'm going to swap myself into free smooth mode. Now this creates a much smaller brush, but what this will do is it will average all the pixels that are selected, and you can see the selection area will always centre on the green sphere, and then each of these yellow spheres represents a vertex. So what I'm going to do is just hold down the left mouse button and you can see it will start to level out the landscape. It will raise and lower the vertices until it creates a more level, smoothed out plane. Now this is a relatively slow process, but you'll see here when I've let go of the mouse button it hasn't fixed the normals. So in this circumstance we can just click this button here and it will automatically fix those normals. Now that is quite slow because that's a particularly jaggedy mountain range that I've created there, but if I do it over here you'll start to see that the different vertices will move in all directions as it starts to try and create a more smoothed appearance. Now based on some earlier feedback I got, I've made this a much more subtle effect, but what I might do is give variable pressure options so that you can make it a little bit faster and a little bit more pronounced if you so wish. But if we just keep doing that, eventually what will happen is the longer we do it, the smoother it will make the landscape. And again, let me just smooth out that. Now you can see when I fix the normals, it's actually created a really smooth area in the middle. But again, that's quite slow. So what you can do, if you're just getting new into it, is hit the smooth alt, and if we do that it will automatically smooth the entire chunk. And you can see there it's now averaged out all the vertices and made this lovely smooth landscape. Okay, again, when I'm using the editing tool I can just hold down the shift key and I can draw with the left mouse button and that will lower the landscape. So controls hopefully are quite straightforward, just left mouse button draws, shift and left mouse button removes. Fairly straightforward process. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm then just going to unilaterally lower this whole landscape again. So now that I've done that, what I've been left with is just the land that's now visible above the water. Now editing works regardless of where you are, so even if I'm above the water just now, if I hold down the left mouse button you'll see it will start to raise the land that's underneath the water. So I can start to draw out small hills. Now it will draw and raise landscapes across seams. It's a little bit slower depending whether it's updating 2 or 4 chunks, or 3 in fact, but it will seamlessly work across the entire world as one large entity. So I'm just going to come in here and start to raise a little bit more landscape. Now my landscape is just below the waterline, so actually it's propping up through the water really quite quickly, but it doesn't have to be. So now I've done that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to smooth the entire chunk again just to smooth out that landscape and create a more level surface. Now this is obviously quite a time consuming way of doing things, although I have made it as quick as possible, but sometimes you might want to just create something a little bit faster. So in this case I'm going to go into the leveling tool. Now the leveling tool works a little bit differently. If I just scroll up my mouse wheel you can see that the playing field moves up and down. Okay, so if I left click, it will raise all the landscape to that level, so very quickly I can start to create large areas. Now this obviously works in water too, so I can start to create really large areas very quickly. Similarly to most of the other tools, shift has a function, so if I hold down shift I can cut out chunks of that landscape. So I can very quickly, if I so wished, cut out a nice little chunk there. I'll just refresh the normal, see what that looks like, and I start to see a nice little image. Now if I then go back into this and smooth the chunk again, then I start to get a far more interesting kind of landscape starting to appeal. But I think this one might just be a little bit too high, so what I'm going to do is just cut that one away. Get rid of all that land there. And I'm going to go back to the raise and level tool, and I'm just going to create a little bit of variation to that one there. I'm just going to smooth the entire chunk again, just so that I get a nice landscape effect there. Okay, now that is the basics of how to alter a landscape. So again, at any point in time I can unilaterally raise and lower the land level to any degree I see fit if I want to create more or less landscape above the water. The water will eventually be able to be toggled on and off. You might not actually want the water in your whole world, and in fact one of the features that's still to be added completely is an export feature, so that you can use it as a scene editor if you want. You don't actually have to save the landscape. There'll be a menu will pop up and ask which elements you want to save, so you'll be able to save just the objects or objects and NPCs, just the landscape, and particles, whatever it is you want to particularly save, you can export just that option. Now the last thing in here is auto mountain function. Now this one's a little bit different to the rest, so what this one works with is you just go in there and you just click where you want it to do it. Now it's going to ask you for a few numbers here, so this first one is the height, so I'm going to set a mountain at 1200 in height. The next one is the radius, so I'm going to set it to 75 in radius. Now this is how many times you want it to smooth out the data in the mountain. So a minimum, 1 looks okay, but it's kind of quite rough. 2 makes it a bit more interesting. So what I'm going to do now is just click turn. It's going to go away, it's going to read in the entire world because mountains can span across chunks seamlessly. So it's going to build the mountain and then it's going to perform the number of smoothing paths that I've told it to, so it's going to be 2. Then it's going to rebuild it. So as I say, it has to basically rebuild the entire world every time you do this. But once it's done, here we have a quite interesting mountainous range. Now it doesn't have fixed normals, so I'm just going to fix normals for it, and boom, there we have our somewhat raggedy but very quickly produced mountainous landscape. And that is the basics of how the editor tool works. So next up I'll show you how we then start to texture our landscape.